Welcome back to Curious Minds, a space where we explore mysteries, history, science, and the ideas that shape how we see the world. For nearly 200 years, a vast civilization was ruled by a distant island empire. A land that once produced emperors, philosophers, mathematicians, and traders across oceans was reduced to a colony. Its wealth extracted, its people divided, its voice suppressed. But history has a strange habit. The more a people are pushed down, the stronger they rise. This is the story of how India fought back, not in one battle, not in one revolution, but through generations of sacrifice, courage, disagreement, and vision. This is the story of the Indian freedom movement.
Wow. Yeah, that really sets the stage perfectly for what we're looking at today.
I thought it captured the scale of it because, for you listening, our mission today is to do a massive deep dive. We've got a huge stack of sources here, historical timelines, encyclopedia entries, academic breakdowns from the EPRA journals. And the goal is to give you a really comprehensive, multi-perspective shortcut to understanding this incredibly complex tapestry of India's fight for independence.
And I think that word is crucial, tapestry. Because what we see in the sources is that this was absolutely not a single monolithic movement. It wasn't just one strategy.
Right, it was a lot of different factions.
Exactly. It was a tapestry of deeply conflicting ideologies. You have folks pushing for strict nonviolence, and at the exact same time, you have armed revolutionary cells operating. You've got diplomatic maneuvering, military mutinies. They were all pushing toward the same ultimate goal of freedom, but they argued fiercely over how to get there.
Which honestly makes it so much more fascinating than the basic textbook summary we usually get.
Yeah.
So, to really understand how all these different resistance methods evolved, we kind of need to establish what they were resisting in the first place. Let's start at the beginning. 1757, the Battle of Plassey.
Right. That's really the consensus starting point in our sources for when the British East India Company, the EIC, shifts from just being maritime traders to a sovereign territorial power in Bengal.
And we really need to emphasize this for everyone listening because it's kind of absurd. The EIC wasn't the British government.
No, not at all. It was a joint stock corporation, a private company with a boardroom of shareholders thousands of miles away in London. And after Plassey, this corporate entity manages to secure the right to collect taxes over massive regions, Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, regions that had more wealth and more people than Britain itself.
It's just wild, a corporate takeover of a subcontinent. And the sources detail how this led to this massive systemic extraction of wealth. They didn't just tax people, they actively broke the local economy.
They absolutely did. Think about the manufacturing base. Bengal was this global hub for textiles, right? Cotton, silk. The EIC comes in and implements these policies that force local weavers to sell their goods exclusively to the company at incredibly depressed prices.
And this is happening right when the British Industrial Revolution is taking off.
Precisely. So the company extracts the raw materials from India for basically nothing, ships them to the mills in Manchester or Lancashire, and then floods the Indian market with machine-made British cloth.
Because they controlled the tariffs. They could put massive export duties on Indian finished goods, making them too expensive to sell abroad, and zero import duties on their own British goods coming in.
That's the exact mechanism. And it completely deindustrialized the region. Millions of highly skilled artisans and weavers were pushed out of trades they had held for generations. They were forced back into subsistence farming.
Which was then heavily taxed by the British anyway.
Right. The wealth transfer was monumental. India essentially became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, but it was at the cost of widespread poverty and regular, devastating famines for its own people.
Okay, so if you're a local farmer or a tribal leader living through this, watching this corporation swallow your land, you don't just sit there for 100 years waiting for a political party to form. You fight back.
What's fascinating here is that resistance really did begin almost immediately. The British narrative at the time often minimized these early tribal revolts, writing them off as just local banditry, but they laid incredibly crucial groundwork.
Like the Santhal Hole, right, in 1855.
Yes. The Santhals were a tribal community in the Bengal presidency. They were being brutally exploited by the British, but also by local moneylenders empowered by the British. And under two brothers, Sito and Kanhu, over 60,000 Santhals rose up.
60,000 people in 1855. I mean, the logistics of organizing that are staggering.
They established their own postal systems, their own command structures. They fought fiercely. They were ultimately suppressed because it was bows and axes against British artillery, but it terrified the East India Company.
And there was the Munda Rebellion, too, a bit later, led by Birsa Munda. He managed to unite thousands of people against colonial land grabs, blending economic grievances with this powerful spiritual revival.
Exactly. And even though Birsa Munda died in a colonial jail at just 25 years old, these revolts proved something vital. They shattered the illusion that the colonial presence was invincible or unquestionable.
Okay, let's unpack this because the psychological shift leads us straight into the first truly continent-wide explosion of resistance, the big one, 1857.
The First War of Independence, often referred to in older texts as the Sepoy Mutiny.
Right. And I want to get into the specific spark for this because it shows how a seemingly small technological change can just ignite a powder keg of cultural tension. Let's talk about the new Enfield rifles.
The pattern 1853 Enfield rifle. This is a textbook example of imperial arrogance. By 1857, the EIC's military was overwhelmingly made up of Indian soldiers called sepoys. The British introduced this new rifle, which requires a specific paper cartridge holding the powder and the bullet.
And to load it, the soldier has to physically bite open the end of the cartridge.
Yes. And the rumor rapidly spreads that the grease used to waterproof these cartridges is made from a mixture of beef tallow and pork lard.
Which is an absolute disaster for the troops. Because for Hindu soldiers, the cow is deeply sacred. And for Muslim soldiers, the pig is haram, strictly forbidden.
To force them to bite into this grease was viewed as a deliberate existential attack on their souls. They genuinely believed the colonial administration was trying to defile their religions to forcibly convert them to Christianity.
Was the grease actually made of that?
Historical consensus suggests that yes, at the primary manufacturing depots, those animal fats were likely being used. The British eventually tried to deny it or change the process, but the trust was entirely broken.
The damage was done. It starts with acts of defiance, like Mangal Pandey sparking the rebellion by attacking his officers. But then it scales up massively.
Yeah.
In Meerut, sepoys break ranks, release imprisoned comrades, and march straight to Delhi.
That march is pivotal. They go to the Red Fort and declare the aging Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as the leader of the rebellion.
Even though he didn't really have any actual power at that point, right?
Right, he was basically a pensioner. But symbolically, it gave this incredibly diverse array of rebels a unified banner. They were trying to resurrect a pre-British political order.
And it wasn't just soldiers. You have local leaders jumping in, like Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. She wasn't fighting over rifle grease. She was fighting the British doctrine of lapse.
Yes, a policy where the British declared that if a native ruler died without a biological male heir, their kingdom automatically lapsed into British control. They annexed Jhansi using this rule.
And Rani Lakshmibai refused to step aside. She literally led her forces into battle and died fighting, becoming this immortal symbol of resistance. But despite heroes like her, the 1857 revolt ultimately fails. Why? If they had the numbers across North India, why did they lose?
It was a lack of unified command and modern logistics. The rebels were fighting isolated regional campaigns. Meanwhile, the British controlled the newly laid telegraph lines. They could coordinate troop movements and call in reinforcements rapidly across the subcontinent.
So technology won the war. But the revolt changed everything. The British Parliament basically fires the East India Company.
Exactly. The Government of India Act of 1858. The British Crown takes direct control. Queen Victoria issues a proclamation promising religious tolerance, but the reality on the ground is profound mutual distrust.
They totally restructure the army, don't they?
Yeah.
To make sure it never happens again.
They strictly limit Indian access to artillery. From then on, the big guns are controlled by British soldiers. They also start mixing ethnicities in regiments to prevent unified uprisings. It becomes a very deliberate divide and rule strategy.
So, military defeat forces Indians to find a new weapon. If you can't beat them with cannons, you have to beat them with politics. Which brings us to the late 1800s and the rise of intellectual nationalism.
The formation of the Indian National Congress, the INC, in 1885. Now, early on, leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale were moderates. They sought representation within the British framework through petitions and delegations.
But Naoroji also did something incredible with data. He compiled the drain theory.
Yes, he mathematically proved, using the colonial government's own statistics, that Britain was systematically draining wealth out of India. He showed that colonialism was inherently a parasitic economic relationship.
But politely presenting data to an empire doesn't usually make them pack up and leave. And that frustration boils over in 1905, when Lord Curzon decides to partition Bengal.
Curzon claimed it was to improve administration because Bengal was too large. He splits it into a Muslim-majority east and a Hindu-majority west.
But the Indian leadership saw right through that.
Absolutely. They saw it as a blatant divide and rule tactic to break the political solidarity of Bengal, which was the epicenter of nationalist thought. And this triggers a massive shift. The moderate approach is sidelined, and the extremists take over.
The famous Lal Bal Pal triumvirate, Lala Lajpat Rai, Phal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal. Tilak boldly makes that famous declaration, "Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it."
Swaraj meaning self-rule, and they launched the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi meaning of one's own country. This is where they move from writing petitions to mass economic boycotts.
Right, they start burning foreign cloth in the streets. I mean, imagine the power of a nationwide boycott today. Hitting the empire's wallet was their first real taste of collective leverage. They started their own indigenous banks, match factories, textile mills.
It was economic warfare. And it worked to a degree. The British actually reversed the partition of Bengal in 1911. But then everything changes with the outbreak of World War I.
The global dynamic totally shifts. Over 1.4 million Indian soldiers end up fighting for Britain in WWI. Why would nationalist leaders support that?
They expected political concessions in return. They believed that if India bled for the empire, the British would be morally obligated to grant them significant self-governance after the war.
But that's not what happened at all. The war ends, and instead of freedom, they get the 1919 Revolt Act.
A draconian piece of legislation. It allowed the colonial state to indefinitely detain suspected revolutionaries without trial and severely restricted the press. It was a massive betrayal.
And the outrage over the Revolt Act leads to April 1919, Amritsar, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Thousands of unarmed people gather peacefully in this enclosed garden area for the Baisakhi festival.
General Reginald Dyer takes command. He marches his troops in, blocks the only narrow exit, and orders them to open fire on the dense crowd without any warning whatsoever.
It's just visceral horror. They fired over 1,600 rounds, only stopping because they ran out of ammo. People were jumping into a well just to escape the bullets. Hundreds die.
This raises an important question, though, according to our sources. How does an empire justify such brutality? The official British count was 379 dead, but Indian estimates put it up to nearly 1,500. And the chilling part is, Dyer was hailed as a hero by a significant portion of the British public. They raised a massive retirement fund for him.
That is sickening. And for the Indian public, that is the moment the demand for freedom becomes absolutely unstoppable. It completely dissolves any illusion of a benevolent British rule. They realize they will never be treated as equals.
The trauma of Amritsar paves the way for a totally unprecedented strategy and a new kind of leader.
Enter Mahatma Gandhi. He introduces these concepts of ahimsa, nonviolence, and satyagraha. Let's dig into satyagraha using that EPRA journal source, because it wasn't just passive resistance, was it?
No, satyagraha translates roughly to truth force. It was an aggressive moral force. Gandhi believed that responding to British violence with more violence just justified their military suppression. Satyagraha was about openly breaking unjust laws and willingly accepting the punishment.
The goal was to trigger a moral collapse within the oppressor, to make them see their own brutality.
Exactly. And practically, it was designed to make the British administration unworkable. The British relied on Indian cooperation to run the country. If millions of people suddenly refuse to cooperate, pay taxes, or work in colonial offices, the system paralyzes.
So what does this all mean on the ground? We see it in the major movements, the non-cooperation movement in 1920, and then the masterpiece of this strategy, the Salt March in 1930.
The Salt March was brilliant political theater. The British had a monopoly on making and selling salt, and they taxed it heavily, which punished the absolute poorest people. So Gandhi walks 240 miles to the sea.
With the global press following him the whole way.
Right. And when he reaches the ocean, he just picks up a handful of salty mud. He makes salt. He breaks the law. Millions of Indians follow suit.
Imagine the logistical nightmare for the British. You have millions of people making salt, refusing to obey laws, and happily accepting prison. The jails completely overflowed.
The state apparatus simply choked on its own enforcement. This strategy reached its peak in 1942 with the Quit India movement. Gandhi gives the do-or-die call, demanding the British leave immediately.
And the British immediately arrest the entire Congress leadership. But the movement just keeps going without them. However, while Gandhi preached strict nonviolence, there was a whole younger generation that deeply disagreed. They believed the British only understood force.
This brings us to the revolutionary path. The Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, the HSRA, we're talking about figures like Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, Sukhdev, Chandrasekhar Azad.
Let's talk about Bhagat Singh. In 1928, the police brutally beat a beloved nationalist leader, Lala Lajpat Rai, during a peaceful protest, and he dies. The HSRA decides to retaliate.
They plan to assassinate the police superintendent responsible, but due to mistaken identity, they kill a junior officer named John P. Saunders in Lahore. They manage to escape the initial dragnet.
But Bhagat Singh wasn't just a gunman. Our sources point out his intellectual depth. He read voraciously about anarchism and revolution. He understood propaganda. So in 1929, he and Batukeshwar Dutt do something incredible. They throw bombs in the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi.
But crucially, these were very low-intensity bombs. They threw them into empty spaces specifically so they wouldn't kill anyone. The explosion wasn't the point. The noise was.
They don't even run away. They stand there shouting, "Inquilab Zindabad, long live the revolution," and let the police arrest them on purpose.
It was pure political theater. They wanted to use the British court system as a loudspeaker for their cause. Every word they said in their defense was printed in the newspapers.
And in jail, they launched massive hunger strikes demanding rights for political prisoners. One of them, Jatin Das, actually dies of starvation after 63 days. It was brutal.
The British eventually expedited the trial and executed Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, and Sukhdev in 1931. Bhagat Singh was only 23, but his martyrdom turned him into a massive folk hero.
And we also have to mention the tragedy of Kalapani, the cellular jail in the Andaman Islands. Thousands of revolutionaries suffered unimaginable isolation and torture there. It was a very dark time. But as the 1930s end, another charismatic leader splits from Gandhi entirely, Subhas Chandra Bose.
Bose, widely known as Netaji. He was a former Congress president, but he fundamentally disagreed with Gandhi's pacifism, especially with World War II looming.
How did he see the war?
He operated on the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He believed independence had to be seized by force while Britain was distracted and weakened by the Axis powers.
So he escapes house arrest in disguise, travels through Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, reaches Germany, and then takes a submarine to Japan. It's like a movie.
He goes to Southeast Asia and revives the Indian National Army, the INA. And he recruits not just Indian POWs captured by the Japanese, but thousands of Indian civilians like plantation workers in Malaya.
Around 40,000 troops, right?
Yeah.
Including a women's unit, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment.
Yes. And his famous battle cry was, "Give me blood and I will give you freedom." They fought alongside the Japanese in the Yugo offensive near the Indian border.
But the campaign fails horribly. Due to poor logistics, starvation, and monsoon rains, Bose dies in a plane crash in 1945. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it looks like a defeat.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the alliance with the Axis was highly controversial, yes. But the INA itself was an incredible model of multi-ethnic, multi-religious unity. And even in military defeat, they achieved a massive psychological victory that we see play out right after the war.
Because WWII just completely drains Britain. But India pays a terrible price too. The 1943 Bengal famine.
Millions of Indians died of starvation, and our sources make it clear this was severely exacerbated by colonial policy. Grain was actively diverted from Bengal to the British war effort.
And Winston Churchill famously dismissed the crisis with shocking indifference. He blamed Indians for breeding too much. The resentment across India hit an absolute boiling point.
So after the war, in 1945, Britain is exhausted. And in this incredibly volatile atmosphere, they make a spectacular miscalculation. They decide to court-martial the defeated officers of the INA at the Red Fort in Delhi.
They thought they were making an example of traitors.
Instead, it unified the entire country in outrage. The Congress, the Muslim League, civilians, and critically, the current Indian soldiers all saw the INA officers as patriots.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The British survived Gandhi's civil disobedience because they had the military to enforce order. But what happens when the military turns against them?
In 1946, inspired by the INA trials, a massive naval mutiny breaks out in Bombay. 20,000 sailors across 78 ships revolt.
They pull down the British flag and hoist the flags of the Congress, the Muslim League, and the Communist Party all tied together.
And looking at the brutal math from our first post video source, Britain is deeply in debt and lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in WWII. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar noted that British rule relied entirely on the loyalty of the Indian Army. Once the soldiers and sailors mutinied, the British realized they physically and financially could no longer hold India.
The game was over. The British finally agree to leave. They send Lord Mountbatten as the last viceroy. But the exit is incredibly rushed, and it comes with a devastating caveat: partition.
The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had strongly advocated for the two-nation theory that Hindus and Muslims required separate sovereign states. Despite strong opposition from Congress initially, rising communal violence convinced leaders that a unified India would descend into civil war.
So they decide to divide the subcontinent into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. And they get a British lawyer, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, to draw the border in just weeks.
He had no prior knowledge of the local demographics. The Radcliffe line was drawn hastily, and incredibly, it wasn't even announced until 2 days after independence.
The suddenness caused sheer panic. Now, we have to be strictly impartial here based on our sources. The suffering during partition was universal. The violence was absolutely not one-sided.
It was horrific across the board. Minorities on both sides of the new borders were targeted. It triggered one of the largest forced migrations in human history. 14 to 20 million people were displaced.
Entire communities uprooted. Trains arriving at stations filled with bodies. Up to 1 to 2 million people killed. Families separated forever. Freedom finally arrived, but at a terrible, unimaginable cost.
Midnight, August 15th, 1947. Jawaharlal Nehru delivers his famous speech declaring, "At the stroke of the midnight hour, India will awake to life and freedom." India was free.
Though debates remain even about that moment, many believe Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who unified the princely states, deserved the first leadership role, but history took Nehru's path. And then the final tragedy strikes.
Just months later, Mahatma Gandhi is assassinated by Nathuram Godse. The man who preached nonviolence becomes a martyr to the violent polarization of partition.
India's freedom was not won by one man or one method. It was built through countless sacrifices, from revolutionaries throwing bombs, to soldiers marching through jungles, to farmers refusing to pay taxes, to ordinary citizens braving baton charges. The question that remains is simple. What will we do with the freedom they fought for?
And I'd add a final thought for our listeners to mull over. Consider the paradox of this era. An empire was brought to its knees by an unprecedented campaign of nonviolence and moral truth. Yet the very moment that nonviolent dream was realized, it was shattered by one of the most violent, religiously driven partitions in human history. What happens to the soul of a nonviolent movement when the nation it births is baptized in such unimaginable violence? It's a question historians and citizens grapple with to this day.
So that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you so much for spending your time with Curious Minds. If you found this discussion interesting, feel free to like, comment, and share your thoughts. And as always, stay curious, stay grounded, and hope to have you join us for the next one.